Good evening and welcome back to World Today. It's been 500 days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To discuss the recent developments in the country, I'm joined here this evening by Dylan Burns, freelance journalist based in the country. Good evening.
Happy to be here.
So, before we start our discussion, let's have a listen to what people had to say about a recent attack which took place in Lviv, a recent Russian attack in which 9 people died and many others were injured.
I saw neighbors heading towards the bomb shelter. We have a bomb shelter in that building over there, and I was going to follow them, but I never managed to. I barely managed to run to the front door with my 2 dogs. I sat down between the 2 walls near the entrance. This must have saved me. I saw orange light in the apartment. Very striking orange light followed by explosion. Boom! And then all windows were blown out. When the air raid sounded, we were awake. 20 minutes later, there was an explosion, but the house was not damaged. And after another 20 minutes, when the rocket hit, that was it.
Of course, there were victims. Let's take a listen to another soundbite talking about Anastasia, who is one of the victims.
Our Anastasia was a wonderful person. She was the sun shining on everyone. She was the closest one I had. She was a wonderful classmate, co-worker, godmother, and a human being. It is sad. There can be no forgiveness for whoever did this.
You understand, no part of Ukraine is safe. A rocket may strike any place. When we found out, of course, we heard the explosions at night. The whole of Lviv did not sleep at the time. When people wrote to me saying that Miroslava and her daughter died, I could not believe this. It was very sad news. It was hard indeed.
So this is just the latest example of Russian atrocities committed in Ukraine, and up until recently, Lviv was regarded as a safe place, right? A lot of journalists based there, a place that still was functioning. What is your take on that?
This is just another page in the long chapter that is the amount of Russian attacks on civilians that we've seen since the start of the war. I have personally documented in both in Mykolaiv during the start of the Kherson counteroffensive and in Kherson after most of the evidence points towards the Russians blowing up the Novokakhovka Dam. While I was there, I saw them deliberately targeting aid workers, and I documented it. This is something that the Russian state has engaged in since the start of the war, since their use of cluster munitions to target civilians in Kharkiv across the country. Not only is this a war crime, but this is something that the Russians have, I don't really think any restraint in doing. They do this constantly. It's a near daily occurrence at this point. And while Lviv is relatively far from the front line, Russian missiles can reach every inch of Ukrainian territory. And so while people might feel safer further from the front, nowhere is safe from the Russian terror campaign if they really, really want to kill civilians, which they seem pretty set on.
Right, and this is something that, to me, it's quite puzzling, because what do they stand to gain? Is it just this scorched earth policy that they're trying to pursue, this tactic, or is there, anything else that they're trying to?
Earlier on in the war, when they were targeting civilian infrastructure, I think it was very much motivated by trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people. I was in Kharkiv while they were targeting the city's civilian infrastructure, the electricity. We had to take cover due to that targeting of civilian infrastructure. And I think it is a combination of them hoping they could break the will of the Ukrainian people, a lack of care for the amount of civilians that are killed, combined with a personal animosity towards the Ukrainian population for rejecting their nation state being turned into a fiefdom by the Russian government.
But these kinds of strategies, for instance, using cluster munitions, can actually backfire, right, so to speak, because now the U.S., if one is, Russian, now the U.S. has said that it will supply Ukraine with these kinds of munitions, right? The cluster bombs and so on. So I guess this will be problematic for the Russians, right?
Yeah, the Russians have been using cluster munitions since the first days of the war, including in urban centers where they're going to be the most damaging to civilian populations. How cluster munitions work is they're fired into the air, and above the target, they disassemble and then drop a bunch of bomblets. What we have sent in the United States to Ukraine is something that can drop 72 bomblets from a single artillery shell fired from one of the M777 howitzers we've sent over, which would be extremely destructive to the Russian entrenched positions in Zaporozhye. I also, though, have a very personal relationship with many deminers in the country who, while they're encouraged by seeing more weapons sent over to Ukraine, especially weapons that can be quite destructive during this Ukrainian counteroffensive, I also want to see, and they want to see, more aid towards demining, because they're going to have to be the people who have to demine the bomblets that don't explode once these cluster munitions are used. So I hope that the United States, along with these cluster munitions, if this is the path that they are taking, that they're going to invest more into the humanitarian aspect and into the demining aspect, since this is going to be a problem for the next 80 to 100 years in Ukraine, which a lot of people don't realize how big of a problem the unexploded ordnance issue is in Ukraine.
Right, and certainly in other places that were previously engaged in conflict, these kinds of the sort of leftover mines are definitely a problem. But there's special equipment, right, to help demine the territory. And now the key issue is to sort of push Russians out of the country. So I wonder, you've mentioned Zaporizhia, right? That you have you've spoken with people who are based there. How likely is this nuclear threat?
I went very close to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant about 6 or 8 months ago when we were first hearing, stories about possible, I would say, possible terror attacks and nuclear terrorism that could be happening there. This is when the IAEA was first visiting, and I personally saw shelling very close to the nuclear power plant, and the explosions were very large. The only thing I could compare it to is just those ammo dump explosions that we see all the time. Very large explosions, very close to the power plant. It has not been treated with the care that a facility that is the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe should be treated with. The Russians have stored military equipment within the plant. Mines are placed around the plant. There's even been reports from the IAEA that there might be some explosives within the plant itself, which would be extremely dangerous. We of course got the Ukrainian intelligence chief that has reported time and time again that there is a legitimate threat of Russian nuclear terrorism, them possibly setting up explosives to cause an incident. And I hope the intelligence chief is wrong, because that would be incredibly reckless. But the Russians could possibly use the cover of deniability by saying, oh, it was the Russians, it was the Ukrainians who shelled us, who knows who did it, to try to get around committing nuclear terrorism, which would 100% be a break in the nuclear taboo. While I think the risk overall, if you were to like a coin flip if it's going to happen or not, is low, as in it's most likely not going to happen, it's substantial enough that the world should be paying attention, and the International Atomic Energy Commission should send more permanent inspectors to the plant to keep the Russians in check. Thankfully, though, they have reported seeing none of this, no explosives planted in places that could cause a nuclear terrorist incident.
Right, and we've all seen that the Russians are capable of this ecocide, right? Following what happened in Kakhovka, so definitely something to keep an eye on. What are the key developments in the country should we be following?
I think one of the main key developments that people should be following, and a lot of attention has not been paid to, is the new executive order that Putin just passed, which is going to force Russian passports on people living in occupied territory, which, if you don't accept a Russian passport, could lead to you losing your property rights, could lead to you being detained or arrested by the Russian Occupation Authority, could lead to you being deported from your home, even if you're not being a direct threat to the Russian government, by you not being subservient to the Russian occupation and not giving up your national identity, they still view you as a threat and will treat you as such. There's also, of course, the counteroffensive going on in Zaporozhye, which the cluster munitions being supplied to should help the Ukrainians in uprooting the Russian positions there, which I hope they are successful in.
So you've mentioned this sort of human aspect, right, with this sort of passports. What about the kids that were kidnapped by the Russian forces, that were forcibly removed from a given territory? How is that effort of regaining or bringing them back going?
It's extremely difficult because the Russians have followed none of the legal processes under international law to remove these children from the war zone. They say, and the war criminals who kidnapped these children say, that they saved these children from the war zone. But any international law scholar will tell you that if children are to be removed from a war zone, they need to be hosted by a neutral third-party country, which the Russians did not do. And they seem to be, from the vast majority of evidence that we see right now, be engaged in a campaign of Russification in trying to make these kids, speak Russian, respect the Russian country that has invaded their homes and leveled their cities, sing Russian songs, sing the Russian national anthem, be proud and be Russian, and hopefully, from the Russian government perspective, create good Russian citizens after kidnapping these children from their families, which is not only a war crime, but one of the worst things you could do to any family suffering through probably the worst time of their lives during this war.
Absolutely. So let's go back. Perhaps you've also mentioned the counteroffensive, which is not going as swiftly and as many have hoped. And now we have this NATO summit coming up on Tuesday. So do you think that anything will change in Western support for Ukraine? Will it be admitted to the alliance? Perhaps more arms? What can we count on in order to help this counteroffensive effort?
Before this war, nobody gave Ukraine any chance of success. It seemed that the entire international community was resided to the idea of Ukraine becoming another part of the Russian empire. Since the war has gone on, everybody has been shocked by Ukrainians' ability to beat against the odds, win against all odds, time and time again. But that doesn't mean that all Ukrainians are like Superman and they have superpowers. The fact that they're engaged in a counteroffensive against Russian forces without air superiority means that they're going to take a lot of casualties. The fact that they're doing it while also not having domination in the amount of artillery shells that they're firing in artillery batteries means that they're going to take a lot of casualties, and also that it's going to be an incredibly difficult task. We have set up the Ukrainians by not providing them sufficient air support, by not providing them sufficient air defense, and by not providing them sufficient artillery support. We've given them an incredibly difficult task ahead of them. But the Ukrainians are still pushing forward. I think when we look at the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, we should be thinking less the Kharkiv counteroffensive, which was a quick breakthrough, and more of the Kherson counteroffensive, a grinding, attritional push to try to untrench the Russians from these positions that they've built up for well over a year now. So the Russians are doing everything they can to stop the Ukrainian advance, and the Ukrainians are fighting against all odds here. So I just want to make sure, because a lot of people try to pretend, the war's already run, it's all over. That isn't the case. We need to be honest about the position that the Ukrainians are in. They're still the underdog here, which means we need to help them with more support, more aid, both humanitarian and military assistance.
Right, and you've mentioned ammunition, which is a key aspect, right? I've read somewhere that actually Russia has an advantage here because the sort of amount produced in the U.S. and Ukraine is not sufficient. What do you know about that?
This is part of the reason why these cluster munitions are being sent over. The Biden administration said that it was an extremely difficult decision, that they considered the humanitarian aspects of sending over cluster munitions, which is the type of weapon that I am personally opposed to. But it's being sent over because they simply cannot produce the amount of shells currently that are necessary for the Ukrainians to succeed in a counteroffensive like this, especially when they don't have air superiority and they don't have superiority in numbers when it comes to when it comes to artillery. And so that is, again, an extremely difficult task for us to send the Ukrainians on to complete. So I really do want to emphasize that they need more artillery guns and they need more artillery. And that's not only going to be dependent upon the United States, but nations like South Korea, who have been engaged in munitions transfer with the United States, the types of shells that are necessary for Ukraine to win. It's going to require the entirety of Europe putting their feet in the sand and saying, yes, we will use our stockpiles to keep Ukraine afloat as long as possible until ammunition production reaches a point that it will no longer be a concern and we won't have to depend on these old Soviet stockpiles and cluster munitions. And I hope that the Biden administration is being honest when they say that's their goal. I have no reason to believe that they aren't being honest when they say that.
Absolutely. This is one of the key aspects. Thank you so much for being with us this evening and for shedding some light on the current situation in Ukraine.
Thank you for having me.